The late summer air in Ohio clung to the walls of my mother's old house, thick with the scent of lavender polish she used to wipe every wooden surface. 2 weeks had passed since her funeral, and yet the room still carried her presence, as if she had just stepped into the garden and might return at any moment. I sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, my hands folded in my lap, trying to ignore how my siblings circled the room like they owned it. The family photographs along the hallway watched us like silent witnesses: birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings when everyone pretended we were closer than we ever were. Sabra, my eldest sister, settled into Mother's chair at the head of the room, her posture deliberate. "We don't have all day," she announced, tapping her nails on the armrest. "The notary will be here shortly." "Let's make this quick." Basia rolled his eyes and leaned back against the wall, muttering, "As if we don't already know how this ends." Dahlia sniffled into her handkerchief, though she had been crying on and off since the funeral in ways that felt more staged than genuine. I kept my voice quiet but firm. "It's not about speed, Sabra. It's about doing things right." Her sharp glance cut across the room. "Spare us the lectures, Eva. You've been the baby of this family your entire life. You don't get to tell us how this should go." The sting of her words was familiar. They had always seen me as the youngest, the one least deserving of respect. Today would be no different. The old oak safe stood in the corner, its presence a shadow in the room. It had been my mother's for decades, holding more than just money or papers. It carried her secrets, her intentions, perhaps her final say in who we were to each other. My chest tightened as I glanced at it. The conversations around inheritance had already begun to rot whatever little bond we had left. I could feel it, the air thickening with greed disguised as grief. Just as the tension reached an uncomfortable silence, the front door creaked open. The notary arrived carrying a weathered leather briefcase and a ring of heavy keys. He was an older man with thinning gray hair, the kind of professional who had seen too many families unravel in rooms just like this. He greeted us with polite warmth, but his eyes lingered on me a moment longer than the rest, a flicker of recognition or warning I couldn't decipher. "Shall we begin?" he asked, placing his case gently on the table. "Finally," Sabra muttered. She gestured toward the safe. "Let's get this over with." I shifted in my seat, only to notice Basia dragging my chair a little farther back from the table, as if to remind me where I stood. I didn't protest. I let the gesture hang there, storing it away like ammunition. The notary crouched by the safe, inserting one key after another until the tumblers clicked. The sound echoed through the room like a drumbeat. My siblings leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with anticipation. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I thought of my mother's hands, how many times she must have touched that same dial, keeping something from us until she was gone. The door creaked open, revealing a neat stack of documents inside. On top lay the expected will, crisp and official, the kind my siblings had probably prepared themselves to hear. But the notary hesitated. His hand brushed against another envelope tucked deeper, sealed with my mother's handwriting across it. The room stilled. He lifted both documents slowly, his brows furrowing, his lips pressed together before he glanced at me again. Leaning closer, his voice barely a whisper, he said, "Run before they read this." My stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" I mouthed back, but he only slid the envelopes onto the table, his hand trembling as he stepped back. Sabra leaned forward instantly, her eyes gleaming. "What's that?" "2 wills," the notary answered, his voice strained. "One typed and notarized, the other handwritten. Sealed." The words landed like a spark in dry grass. My siblings erupted with questions, but I couldn't speak. My pulse roared in my ears. 2 wills. My mother had left something hidden. As I tried to steady myself, Sabra's eyes darted to mine. She smirked, leaning in just close enough for me to hear her venom. "You always thought Mom loved you most," she hissed. "Let's see if she really left you anything." Basia chuckled under his breath, while Dahlia gave me a pitiful look that stung worse than a slap. I kept my face still, my voice locked inside. Rage and shame surged, but I swallowed it whole. I knew if I gave them anything, they would twist it and use it against me. They say you don't really know your family until someone dies, I thought, staring at the envelopes. And they were right. The notary cleared his throat, trying to regain order. My siblings pressed in closer, demanding he read. I noticed his hands trembling, the paper shaking between his fingers. I remembered my mother's whisper from weeks before, "Don't let them take what's yours." Sitting there, cornered but not defeated, I realized the truth was about to be stripped from me, or it was about to arm me. Silence would be my shield, at least for now. The room hadn't changed, but it felt smaller after the notary's revelation. My siblings hovered near the table, their voices rising and falling like waves hitting against a stubborn rock. The discovery of 2 wills had thrown gasoline on the smoldering tensions already choking the air. Instead of pausing to reflect on what our mother had intended, they insisted we all sit down, as a family, to decide how to handle it. Sabra pulled out Mother's chair again, her authority assumed without question. She looked around the room and finally fixed her eyes on me. "Let's settle this before it becomes ugly. The adults will handle it. You can listen." I swallowed back a retort. I had heard variations of that line all my life. Let the older ones decide. You're too young. You don't understand. At 34, I was hardly young, but in this house, I was always the child who didn't belong at the grown-up table. Baccia leaned on the back of a chair, smirking. "Honestly, Ziva, you should be grateful you even get to be here. Some families wouldn't bother calling the youngest in at all." Dahlia dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief she carried like a badge of fragility. "This is so stressful," she murmured, her voice breaking conveniently, just as Sabra straightened up to speak. "Can we please just get through this without making it harder than it already is?" I sat down, my heart sinking as I noticed my chair wasn't at the table anymore. It had been dragged back a few feet, angled away as though I were an observer, not a participant. Nobody acknowledged the change, but everyone saw it. Sabra cleared her throat and clasped her hands in a performance of poise. "We'll hold a council, just us siblings. We decide what's fair. We know Mother's intentions better than anyone else." "Fair?" I echoed before I could stop myself. Her eyes flashed like a judge silencing a defendant. "Yes, fair." "And don't interrupt." The conversation tumbled forward without me. Each time I opened my mouth to add something, Sabra cut me off with a dismissive wave, or Baccia joked about how I never put a dime into the family estate. Dahlia chimed in with whimpers and sighs that pulled sympathy away from me and toward her trembling hands. Bitterness rose like bile, but I pressed my palms against my knees, grounding myself in silence. My mother's voice came back to me, her hand resting over mine just weeks before she passed. "Hold your dignity, Ziva. They'll try to strip it from you piece by piece. Don't let them." So I sat, swallowing words, watching them pretend fairness was possible when their minds were already made. The longer they spoke, the deeper the humiliation cut. I wasn't invisible. I was deliberately diminished. That distinction mattered. When Dahlia finally stood to fetch water for everyone, I thought the moment might break the tension. She returned with a tray of glasses filled with ice, wedges of lemon perched delicately at the rim. She passed them out one by one, offering small smiles of comfort to Sabra and Baccia. When she reached me, she set a glass in front of me. Empty. No ice, no lemon. Just clear tap water that barely filled half the glass. I stared at it for a long moment. Sabra didn't look at me, but I caught the flicker of her smile at the corner of her mouth. "Oh," Dahlia said quickly, feigning surprise. "Must have been a mistake." She made no move to fix it. Nobody offered me their glass. The room just moved on. I curled my fingers around the cool, weightless cup and forced my face into neutrality. Respect isn't demanded, I thought. It's revealed by how people treat you when they think you have no power. The humiliation burned hotter than anger. It wasn't the glass itself, it was the message. You don't count. You don't deserve even the smallest courtesy. Still, I didn't drink from it. I didn't touch it. I let it sit there, a symbol that they thought I was too weak to notice, but I noticed everything. Silence was not weakness, it was memory. And I was storing every insult, every slight, like ammunition. As the so-called council droned on, I drifted inward. Families don't just fracture through big betrayals, they erode through 1,000 small cuts. A chair moved back, a glass left empty, a voice dismissed before it formed. These gestures weren't clumsy mistakes. They were weapons sharpened by habit. All my life I'd been the youngest, the one shielded from decisions, stripped of authority by birth order. And yet, in these walls, I had carried the heaviest load. I had been the one who cooked for Mother when she couldn't stand, who drove her to appointments, who stayed when everyone else found excuses to leave. But to them, that work was invisible. Duty, not sacrifice. Basic, as Sabra once called it. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about inheritance. It was about recognition, dignity, the validation of years my mother and I spent together when no one else came. The more I thought of it, the less wounded I felt. The pain began shifting into something colder, sharper. I would not fight them with shouts. They thrived on noise. I would fight them with the one thing they could not predict: patience. The so-called council ended without resolution. My siblings pretended civility, but the air buzzed with smugness. Sabra smiled at the notary as though she had already won, her hand resting on the documents like she owned them. I watched, silent, my empty glass untouched. They thought the council had proven my weakness. What it had really proven was their fear, that if I ever spoke, the truth would unmask them. As Sabra whispered something low to the notary, his eyes dropped to the table, uneasy. My chest tightened. Whatever she was planning, it was just beginning. They thought I was too weak to fight back, but weakness has its own power. The air in the living room had grown stale, filled with the kind of silence that wasn't peace, but pressure. After the council, after the empty glass that sat like an insult in front of me, I needed to breathe. I rose without asking and slipped into the kitchen, letting the doorframe mark a boundary between me and the suffocating performance they were still putting on in the other room. The kitchen smelled faintly of polish and old wood, but underneath it lingered something gentler: lavender and lemon, my mother's favorite combination. The counters were neat, though I knew Sabra had already combed through drawers earlier that day, looking for anything she could claim as evidence of control. I leaned against the counter, drawing in the emptiness, trying to quiet the storm inside me. Silence, I reminded myself, was not weakness. Sometimes silence was a shield, and in moments like this, it was the only thing that kept me intact. My mother had always said patience would outlast cruelty. She had told me to hold my dignity when others wanted me stripped bare. I could still hear her voice. Your worth isn't decided by how loud you shout, but by how long you can stand. The contrast struck me. Just a few feet away, my siblings sat in the living room, tearing each other apart with polite venom. And here in the kitchen, her spirit still lingered. This space carried warmth they couldn't touch. I closed my eyes and let the memory come. It was late one night, only a few weeks before she passed. The house was quiet, but I had heard her call softly from her bedroom. I rushed in, and she took my hand, her skin papery thin, her grip surprisingly firm. Her eyes, though clouded, found mine with clarity. I know they don't see you, she whispered, her breath shallow, but her voice deliberate. But I do. Don't worry, I've taken care of it. I remember the way her fingers tightened, as if trying to anchor her words into me. There had been urgency, an insistence that went beyond comfort. It was a promise. I had asked what she meant, but she only gave me a small smile, her lips pale and trembling. At the time, I thought she was soothing me. Tonight, in this house where her absence felt louder than any presence, I realized it was more. That promise was about the will, the hidden one. She had known this storm was coming, and she had left me her final protection. I sat at the small kitchen table, resting my head in my hands, and let the tears come. They weren't for the inheritance. They were for the validation. Finally, someone had seen me for what I was, not what they told me I wasn't. For years I had been invisible to my family, but not to her. When I lifted my head, my eyes caught a splash of color near the folded linens. On the counter, stacked neatly, was a pile of towels my mother had used for years. Most were plain, faded with time and washing, but one was different. I picked it up carefully, unfolding it. Across the corner, stitched in slightly uneven thread, was my name, Ziva. The sight stole my breath. None of the other towels carried names. This was hers, done by her hand, each loop of thread proof that she thought of me even in the smallest corners of her life. I pressed the fabric against my chest, the faint scent of soap clinging to it. Tears welled again, but these were softer, steadier. Love, I realized, hides in the smallest places. Not in declarations, not in grand gestures, but in stitches on a towel, in whispered words at midnight. Holding that towel, I felt stronger. I wasn't invisible to her. I never had been. A thought surfaced, crisp and unshakable. The chair pulled back, the empty glass, the dismissals. They were nothing compared to this. They could erase my voice in the living room, but they couldn't erase this thread, this fabric, this proof. I remembered a saying I once heard, "The quietest person in the room often has the loudest mind." Tonight, I understood it. My silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to endure, to watch, and to act at the right moment. My siblings were drunk on their own confidence, convinced I was weak. But the towel in my hands, the memory of my mother's whisper, told me otherwise. I wasn't the forgotten one. I was the one she trusted most. From the living room came laughter, sharp and cruel, as though they had already won. I clenched the towel tighter, my mother's promise echoing in my ears. They thought I was forgotten, but my mother left me more than they ever imagined. When I stepped back into the living room, the air felt thicker, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to hear what would come next. My bag pressed against my hip, the towel folded neatly inside, hidden like armor I wasn't ready to reveal. My siblings had opened a bottle of wine, their laughter a little too sharp, a little too forced. It was the kind of laughter that told me they weren't celebrating. They were rehearsing victory before it was even secured. The notary shuffled papers nervously, his eyes flicking to me and then away, as if he was trapped between obligation and fear. Sabra dominated the center of the room, glass of red wine in her hand, her posture rehearsed for an audience. "We need to decide," she announced, voice cool and commanding. "This family cannot afford chaos. We'll make a decision before the legal formalities drag us into months of embarrassment." I sat down slowly, each step measured, as if I were walking into a trap. My pulse was steady, but inside, every nerve told me I was prey in a room of predators. Still, I smiled faintly, refusing to show them the fear they wanted. Sabra turned toward me with a sly glance. "And before you start, Ziva, let me be clear. If you make noise about that second will, we can prove you're unstable." My breath caught. The words landed not like a suggestion, but a weapon. "You've always been too emotional," she went on, circling me with her words. "Fragile, you break down. People like you can't be trusted with something this important." Beishia leaned forward, smirking. "She's right, you know. You've got that look in your eye again, ready to cry, always the sensitive one." Dahlia, ever the performer, let out a heavy sigh. "This is tearing us apart. If Ziva can't handle the stress, maybe she should step aside." The humiliation burned, but behind it came clarity. I realized Sabra wasn't arguing facts. She was playing a script I'd seen before in this country. Women labeled crazy whenever they became inconvenient, their credibility shredded by whispers of instability. It was psychological warfare, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Talia looked down at her lap, fiddling with her bracelet. She said nothing, but the silence of someone who should have spoken was louder than any accusation. Her fear of Sabra's dominance was plain. I straightened, my voice calm, even amused. "Funny," I said, holding her gaze, "how truth always sounds unstable to those who fear it." The room went silent for a beat. Beishia's smirk faltered, and Sabra's eyes narrowed like daggers. Dahlia jumped in quickly, her tone saccharine. "At least Mom remembered you, Ziva. Even if it's just a small note, it's something, right?" A ripple of chuckles spread across the room. Humiliation dressed as kindness. I could almost admire the cruelty. It was efficient. I gripped my knees under the table to steady myself, refusing to let them see the sting. Americans of a certain age would recognize this move, fake kindness as a blade, slicing deeper than open hostility ever could. Sabra raised her glass slightly. Yes, we should all be grateful for what little acknowledgement we got. That's the spirit of unity. I met her gaze, my voice colder now. I'd rather have a line of truth than a mountain of lies. The words dropped like a stone in the middle of the room. The chuckles died, the air turned brittle. Even the notary froze, his pen hovering above the paper. Sabra blinked once, twice, then set her glass down with precision. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. She had seen it. I wasn't as passive as she thought. The conversation limped on, but I had already withdrawn inward. I understood now that her threat wasn't just about inheritance. She didn't want to cut me out of the money. She wanted to erase me entirely, to paint me as unstable, unreliable, forgettable. I touched the towel hidden in my bag, remembering my mother's whispered words. I know they don't see you, but I do. Strength swelled in my chest. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. I'd read that quote once, and now it pulsed through me like prophecy. I would not fall into their traps. I would not scream. I would wait, watch, and strike at the moment they least expected. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with brittle laughter, the kind that breaks if you breathe too hard. I stayed silent, watching Sabra lean close to the notary, whispering something too low for me to hear. My unease deepened. She was making a deal behind my back, twisting the pieces of the game while I was forced to watch. The game had only just begun, and I was the piece they thought they could move off the board. The night dragged on, and instead of diffusing the tension, it only deepened. Wine glasses clinked, voices overlapped, and the air seemed ready to shatter with every sharp word tossed across the room. The notary had withdrawn to a quiet corner, scribbling in his notes, his face pale as if he regretted ever agreeing to this job. I stayed seated, calm on the outside, though the rhythm of my heart pounded with each insult disguised as discussion. Sabra tapped her glass and announced, "Let's stop wasting time. If we're talking about what's fair, we should start with what each of us contributed." Her words weren't an invitation. They were a verdict waiting for me. Baisha jumped in, his grin crooked. "I put money into the house when the roof leaked. Paid cash for the repairs. I even covered Mom's medical bills once when insurance didn't kick in." He turned his head toward me. "What exactly did you do, Ziva?" "You didn't pay for anything, unless showing up counts as currency." Their eyes cut to me like knives, waiting for my stumble. I didn't flinch. "You're right. I didn't have thousands to throw at it. What I had was time." The pitch of the room climbed, voices competing. Sabra leaned back, shaking her head. Time is not the same as money. It doesn't carry the same weight. The argument roared louder. Every word thrown my way had the same undercurrent. You don't matter. You don't belong at this table. When people shout about fairness, I thought, staring at my folded hands, it usually means they want more than their share. The noise reached its peak. Then suddenly all eyes snapped back to me as if daring me to defend myself. My throat tightened, but I refused to shrink back. I took a breath and said, "I was the one at the hospital every night. I was the one making sure Mom ate. I was the one holding her hand when none of you were here." For a moment, silence fell. Then Dahlia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Don't turn this into a martyr story. That's what daughters do. It's duty, not sacrifice." Sabra's lips curled into a cold smile. "Love isn't currency. You don't get paid for being a daughter." Her dismissal cut deep, but I steadied myself. "No," I answered, my voice even. "You don't get paid for it. You just live with the fact that you didn't show up." Basha slammed his hand on the table. "Don't you dare try to guilt us. We all had lives, jobs, responsibilities. You stayed because you had nothing else to do." Heat rose up my chest. Their words weren't just minimizing, they were erasing me. "Sometimes the heaviest work is invisible," I said, my voice low but sharp. "And that's why you can dismiss it so easily." The room cracked open into chaos. Sabra raised her voice over mine, accusing me of twisting the truth. Dahlia wept into her handkerchief, drawing attention back to herself, as if my words were cruelty aimed at her instead of truth aimed at all of them. The division was clear. A few relatives looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between us, but no one stepped in. And Talia, sweet, careful Talia, kept her gaze fixed on the table, her silence adding to the weight pressing me down. But instead of folding, I steadied my voice. "I'm not screaming," I told them calmly, "because I don't need to. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand." Sabra's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to me holding my ground without raising my voice. Inside, I reminded myself of something I'd once heard. Americans respect the person who stays calm, while everyone else loses control. And in that moment, the respect wasn't for them. It was for me, to myself. The fight broke apart in fragments. Some stormed out of the dining room to get more wine, others muttered curses under their breath. The notary sat frozen with his pen. For a brief moment, there was peace in my stillness. Later, I stepped outside to the porch, letting the night air cool my skin. The cicadas hummed in the distance, indifferent to the battles waged behind these walls. I wrapped my arms around myself, inhaling deeply. Then my phone rang. Bacha's name lit up the screen. I answered, my voice steady. "Yes?" His voice came low and hard, every syllable a threat. "If you even think about contesting that will, you'll be cut out of this family for good. You'll be nothing. Do you understand me?" I closed my eyes, listening. For a flicker of a moment, fear slid in. Old, familiar. But as he spoke, that fear twisted into something else. Calm. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing me flustered. I let him talk, storing each word like evidence. When he finished, I said simply, "Thank you for letting me know where you stand." Then I ended the call. The night sky stretched above me, vast and clear. I exhaled, feeling the shift deep inside. Threats reveal desperation, and desperation means weakness. That night, I stopped being their little sister. I became their opponent. When I walked back into the living room after Baisha's call, something felt different. The air was thicker, the atmosphere staged like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. My siblings were in full performance mode, wine in their hands, voices pitched with false cheer. Sabra was directing the room like a conductor, her words slicing through every pause, keeping control with a mix of confidence and menace. "Let's get this sorted," she said firmly, cutting off the notary before he even began. Every time his lips parted, she interrupted with some polished line about unity or mother's legacy. Dahlia sat curled on the couch, her tears flowing softly, always on cue, always making me look like the harsh one if I so much as breathed too loudly. I sat quietly studying them. Every gesture, every sigh, every fake tear was theater. Their cruelty wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. They weren't just dividing property, they were staging a narrative, one where I was the outsider, unstable, the problem. The voices clashed like a storm, each louder than the next, overlapping until the sound pressed against my skull. Sabra's authority, Dahlia's whimpers, Baisha's scoffs, it was a hurricane meant to drown me. Then Sabra stood, lifting a sheet of paper with a flourish. "This," she declared, her voice trembling in mock sorrow, "is the second will, but I won't let it tear us apart." Before anyone could react, she struck a match and held it to the corner. The paper flared, curling black as fire consumed it. Gasps rippled across the room. Dahlia clutched her chest. Baisha muttered, "She's right. Mom wouldn't want us fighting." Sabra's eyes glistened with crocodile tears. "Mom loved us too much to let us be divided by this. Let's burn it and move forward." The room stilled. Even the notary, pale and rigid, said nothing. His silence betrayed fear more than agreement. He watched the ash fall but didn't intervene. I stared, disbelief coursing through me. That wasn't the second will. I knew it. The real one was hidden somewhere else. But Sabra's performance was masterful. Her destruction created an illusion of closure. To anyone watching, it looked like she had sacrificed division for the sake of unity. My chest burned hotter than the flames she fed. "You burned the wrong truth," I said quietly, my words almost swallowed by the crackle of the last ember. Sabra's lips curved into a smirk, her voice low, aimed directly at me. Or maybe I burned the only truth that matters. The betrayal was sharp, but what stunned me more was the complicity. Dahlia praised Sabra's courage, patting her arm as if she had done something noble. Betia turned on me, his finger stabbing the air. "This is your fault," he snapped. "You're the one causing division. Sabra is fixing it, and you're just stirring the pot." The smell of ash hung in the air, stinging my throat. It felt like my mother's voice had been reduced to smoke, drifting into nothingness. But inside, I thought, fire doesn't always destroy. It reveals who fears the truth most. I sat straighter, though my body shook. Their showmanship had fooled the others, but I knew the truth hadn't been erased. It was still somewhere, waiting. Hours later, the storm of voices gave way to tired laughter, the kind that masks fear. I excused myself, stepping outside into the cool night air. The driveway glowed under a pale moon. That's when I saw Betia. He was shoving Mother's furniture into the back of his truck, her rocking chair, the china she polished every Thanksgiving, even framed photographs that had hung on the walls for decades. I walked closer, anger steadying my steps. "She's barely in the ground," I said, my voice sharp. "And you're already selling her memory?" He didn't even flinch. He slammed the tailgate shut and shrugged. "Better me than strangers. Somebody has to handle it. Besides, you never cared about the material things, right? Isn't that what you always said?" The sight of it, the things that carried our family's history reduced to objects tossed in a truck, was worse than the fire. The looting wasn't just physical. It mirrored the emotional theft I had endured all evening. "It's not just the things you want gone," I whispered, mostly to myself. "It's me." Betia climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life. He didn't look at me again as he drove away, the furniture rattling in the back. I stood under the night sky, fury carving itself into resolve. I clutched my bag, pressing my hand against the towel hidden inside, its stitches a reminder that my mother's truth still lived, even if they tried to bury it. They could burn paper and steal furniture, but they hadn't yet stolen my silence, and silence was my sharpest blade. Morning light spilled through the windows of my mother's house, but it did nothing to brighten the atmosphere. The rooms felt hollow, stripped of her presence, yet full of performances my siblings continued to stage. They moved about the kitchen and living room with exaggerated politeness, passing plates and offering smiles that never reached their eyes. "Coffee?" Dahlia asked, her voice too sweet. She set a cup in front of Sabra with trembling hands, then glanced at me with a look that said, "Don't get too comfortable here." I took the seat closest to the window, the towel still tucked in my bag, my shield against all of this. The notary sat stiffly at the dining table, his eyes fixed on his paperwork. When I caught his gaze, he looked away instantly. Fear was etched into his posture, the kind of fear that comes from knowing Sabra's reach extended further than it should. I heard her voice before I saw her. Sabra stood in the hallway, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her back straight as a soldier. Her voice was hushed, deliberate. I didn't need to hear the words to know she was maneuvering. Deception works best when it's wrapped in civility, and she was an expert at the disguise. The house was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that tells you a storm hasn't passed, only shifted direction. Later that morning, I slipped into a cafe downtown, needing a moment away from the suffocating civility. That's when I saw her again. Sabra, seated in the corner with a man in a navy suit. She leaned close, her tone clipped and confident. I slid into the booth behind them, careful to keep my eyes down. Their voices carried just enough. "If we frame her as confused," the man said, "the second will won't hold. Courts don't take handwritten wills seriously if there's a shadow of doubt about competence." Sabra's laugh was sharp. "Then Ziva has nothing. She'll crumble." My chest tightened. They weren't just trying to erase me, they were assassinating my mother's dignity. The strategy wasn't about facts, it was about rewriting her memory, turning her final words into nonsense. "Do you have access to her medical records?" the lawyer asked. Sabra nodded. "I'll get what I need. The doctors saw her in pain. They'll admit confusion if pressured. People can be persuaded." I gripped my cup until the heat stung my palm. My mother had been sharp until the very end. I had sat with her, heard her recall dates, memories, prayers without falter. And now my sister wanted to twist that truth into a lie, just to strip me of the little she had left me. The lawyer's voice lowered. It won't be difficult. Families do this all the time. Mental capacity is easy to question. Sabra's reply was calm, venomous. Good. Let's get it done. By the time Ziva realizes what's happening, it will be too late. I left before I could throw my coffee in her face. My fury was too sharp, too dangerous to show. If I confronted her there, she'd only paint me as hysterical. Instead, I carried the conversation like a stone in my chest, heavy but undeniable proof of her game. I drove to the clinic where my mother had spent her last months, hoping to find allies, maybe even a nurse who could speak to her clarity. The hallways smelled of antiseptic, the hum of machines low and constant. I found a familiar face near the nurse's station, Elaine, the nurse who had always spoken kindly about my mother. Relief rose in me. Elaine, I said softly, you remember my mother, don't you? You remember how sharp she was. Her eyes flickered, darting past me. She pressed her lips into a thin line. I'm not sure, Ziva. Those months were hard. She was confused at times. Confused? That wasn't what she'd said before. My stomach twisted. Then I saw it. Sabra, walking down the hall, an envelope slipping discreetly into Elaine's hand. Elaine tucked it into her pocket, her eyes falling to the floor. The betrayal stung worse than anything my siblings had said. This was a woman who had once told me, "Your mother's mind is strong. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Now she avoided my gaze, her silence bought and sealed. I stepped back, my voice trembling but cold. Truth can be bought only if it's too weak to stand on its own. Is that what you think of her? Elaine said nothing. She couldn't meet my eyes. The envelope in her pocket wasn't just paper. It was currency. A transaction that turned loyalty into silence, memory into doubt. As I walked out of the clinic, my chest ached, but my mind sharpened. Sabra's strategy was clear. Burn evidence, bribe witnesses, rewrite history. This wasn't just greed. It was war. They say blood is thicker than water, I thought, tightening my grip on my bag, but sometimes it's poison in the veins. I would not only need my silence, I would need strategy, precision. If she wove a web of lies, I would find the thread to unravel it. The towel brushed against my fingers through the fabric of my bag, the stitches spelling my name. I held onto it like a lifeline as I stepped into the sunlight outside. They had woven a web of lies, but webs can snap when you pull at the right thread. By late afternoon, the house felt more like a courthouse than a home. My siblings insisted on one last round of talks, calling it a final discussion before anything could be official. I knew what it really was, another ambush, staged to make me look like the problem. The notary sat stiff in his chair, silent, his pen idle in his hand. Sabra took her usual place at the head of the table, commanding the room with her practiced authority. Dahlia hovered close by, her handkerchief ready, while Basia leaned against the wall with a smirk that made my skin crawl. Even Talia, eyes downcast, seemed resigned to the role Sabra had cast her in, silent witness. Sabra's voice rang out, calm and cutting. This family needs unity, and we all know who's breaking it. We're here to settle that. Her eyes flicked to me, making it clear that the accused was already chosen. It felt like standing before a jury where the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Families can turn grief into these mock tribunals where every word is twisted into evidence. And here I was, the defendant, seated in silence as they sharpened their knives with smiles. "Ziva," Sabra said sweetly, "why don't you sit over there? We need room at the table." She pointed to a chair by the door, next to the trash bin. I paused, the weight of the insult pressing down. Every eye followed me as I crossed the room and sat. The scrape of the chair against the floor echoed like a gavel. Sabra offered a thin smile. "Nothing personal, we just needed space." I looked at her steadily. "You think distance makes me smaller," I said evenly. "It only makes you crueler." Her smile didn't falter. "Cruel? No, Ziva. Practical." Laughter fluttered from Basia, and even Dahlia smirked behind her handkerchief. The notary's eyes darted to me, uneasy but silent. Respect isn't always stolen in shouts, it's stolen in where they make you sit. The room pressed in tighter. Sabra's words dripped honey, but every syllable was poison. We're here because we love each other, but love doesn't mean indulging one person's fantasies. Mother wouldn't want division. Dahlia's tears came on cue. She's right, this fighting is tearing us apart. Ziva, why can't you just let things go? Basia added fuel. She thrives on drama, always has. The hypocrisy made me nauseous. They cloaked their greed in the language of love and unity while stripping me down piece by piece. I sat still, gripping the arms of the chair, reminding myself that silence could be sharper than rage. Sometimes families don't break apart, I thought bitterly. They rot from within. The storm reached its peak when voices overlapped, accusations volleyed across the table. I could feel their eyes, their contempt, trying to choke the air from me. Yet I stayed calm, my voice low and deliberate when I finally spoke. You call me divisive, I said, but all I've done is sit here. Maybe the rot isn't coming from me. The words hung heavy, cutting through the noise. For a moment, silence returned, fragile and brittle. And then, as if the house itself had had enough, a sound shattered the quiet. A framed family photo, perched on the mantel, slipped and crashed to the floor. Glass splintered across the hardwood, the frame split open. Everyone froze. I bent to pick it up, ignoring the sting as glass cut into my palm, my eyes locked on the image inside. There we were, all lined up, stiff smiles for the camera. And there, clear as day, was my mother's hand, resting firmly on my shoulder. Not Sabra's, not Dahlia's, mine. I held the photo high enough for all of them to see. Even in silence, I said, my voice calm but cold. She chose me. The room shifted. Sabra's face tightened. Dahlia looked away. Basia's smirk faltered. Even Talia's eyes flicked up, the faintest flicker of recognition breaking through her fear. The notary met my gaze, and though he said nothing, the look in his eyes was acknowledgement. He had seen it too. Sabra tried to recover, brushing her hand dismissively. It's just a photo, Ziva. Don't make it into more than it is. But the truth was already out. They had all seen what I saw, even if they would never admit it aloud. The silence after my words carried more weight than their arguments ever had. I tightened my grip on the shattered frame, ignoring the small line of blood pooling in my palm. Broken glass, broken family, but proof that even in her quiet way, my mother had marked me as hers. I turned my eyes back to Sabra, unflinching. For the first time, she looked away. They wanted me by the trash, but even broken glass reflects the truth they can't erase. I retreated to my room after the chaos of the shattered photo, my palm still stinging from where the glass had cut me. The silence inside these four walls was different. It wasn't hostile like in the dining room. It was heavy, reverent, as if my mother's spirit lingered here more than anywhere else. My knees bent slowly as I lowered myself beside her old chest of belongings, the one she had kept tucked away at the foot of her bed. My fingers trembled as I reached for the latch. Desperation and reverence battled inside me. I wasn't looking for money or jewels. I was looking for her voice, something that could not be rewritten or burned. I whispered to myself, truth doesn't just sit on the surface, it waits where love last left it. The drawers creaked, reluctant to open, but finally they gave way. Beneath folded linens that still carried the faint scent of lavender and starch, I saw the corner of a worn leather book. My breath caught. I pulled it out with both hands, clutching it as if it were fragile glass. It was my mother's journal. I opened it carefully, eyes skimming over her familiar handwriting. Each letter curved exactly as I remembered. My chest ached as I turned the pages, tracing her words. Then I found it. A line scrawled firmly across one page, dated just weeks before her death. If they fight you, remember this is yours. I made it so. I pressed the journal against my chest, tears spilling freely. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't paranoia. My mother had seen this battle coming. She had armed me. In America, I thought, a will can be contested. Lawyers can argue. Judges can doubt. but a mother's words, written in her own hand, are harder to erase. I whispered into the quiet, you knew this day would come. The journal felt less like paper and ink, more like armor. She had given me proof, but more importantly, she had given me validation. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I was the one she trusted. I wiped my tears, tucked the journal into my bag beside the embroidered towel, and stood taller than before. When I returned to the dining area, the scene had shifted into something sickening. Sabra was standing, her arms spread as if conducting a sermon. "We all want peace, don't we?" she said with syrupy sweetness. "We should honor Mom's memory with unity." Baisha nodded quickly. "She's right, no more fighting." Dahlia dabbed her eyes and chimed in. "This family needs healing, not conflict." Even Talia sat frozen, her lips pressed tight, her silence as loud as Sabra's words. The hypocrisy weighed on me like stones. Their smiles were rehearsed, their lines polished. This wasn't peace, it was performance. I took a seat quietly, keeping my hand on the bag that now carried both the towel and the journal. My mind was sharper now, cold clarity replacing grief. I didn't need to argue yet. I just needed to watch. Sabra's voice carried on, dripping with false warmth. "Mother's legacy isn't about papers or possessions. It's about us, together. We must not let greed tear us apart." Her phone, sitting face up on the table, lit up suddenly. A text notification flashed, the glow catching my eye. I shifted subtly, leaning just enough to glimpse the message. It was from a realtor. "Confirmed. Listing for your mother's house scheduled. Paperwork ready. We'll finalize next week." My breath froze in my chest. Sabra, the champion of unity, the self-proclaimed guardian of legacy, was already selling our mother's home while lecturing us about love and family. Anger coiled in me, icy and sharp. She wasn't just lying, she was dismantling everything while pretending to save it. She continued, oblivious to the fact that her mask had slipped in my eyes. "We must think of Mom's legacy together." Inside my head, I answered her. "Her legacy is the very thing you're selling off." The glowing screen was a mirror, reflecting her duplicity for me alone to see. Symbolism burned into me. Unity in her mouth, betrayal in her hand. I wrapped my fingers tighter around the journal in my bag. Now I held two weapons, her words in ink and Sabra's hypocrisy in light. Sabra smiled as she concluded her speech. "If we hold hands through this, no one can tear us apart." I didn't move. I didn't need to. I had seen enough. She thought she was scripting the play, but I was holding the script she didn't know existed. The house was no longer just ours. By evening, it had transformed into something larger, heavier. Relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors who had once borrowed sugar from my mother, even members of her church congregation, all had gathered inside, sitting stiff in folding chairs dragged from the basement. The notary shuffled his papers with nervous hands, his eyes darting between Sabra and me. My siblings sat smugly at the long table, Sabra positioned once again at the head like a self-appointed judge. I clutched my mother's journal against my chest, the leather worn smooth by years of her hands. Inside me, the anger had sharpened into something cleaner, steel edged with patience. Betrayal can silence a person, but silence can also forge them into something unbreakable. I stared at the book and thought, sometimes the loudest voice in the room is a piece of paper. Tonight, I would let hers speak. Sabra rose, clearing her throat as though she were about to deliver closing arguments in a courtroom. "We must all remember," she began, her tone syrupy, "that unity matters more than anything else. Mother would want us together, not divided by petty documents." I stood slowly, cutting her off mid-sentence. My voice was calm, but it carried, "Enough." The room turned. I opened the journal, my hand steady now. This is my mother's voice, and it deserves to be heard. Gasps echoed as I read aloud. "If they fight you, remember this is yours. I made it so." Sabra froze, her face paling, the mask cracking. Dahlia's hand went to her mouth, her handkerchief trembling. Bashia's eyes narrowed, searching for a rebuttal he didn't have. "This is her handwriting," I said, lifting the page for all to see. She wasn't confused. She wasn't coerced. She knew exactly what she was doing. Sabra's voice broke through, sharp with fury. This proves nothing. Scribbles in a book. The notary, pale but firm, cleared his throat. I have compared this with her signed letters and legal forms. The handwriting matches perfectly. This is authentic. The murmurs grew into a wave, neighbors whispering, relatives exchanging looks heavy with judgment. Handwritten words carried weight in this community. They weren't just ink. They were the last breath of truth someone left behind. I closed the book gently. You can silence me, but you cannot silence her. The silence that followed was different, stunned, reverent, shifting the power in the room. For the first time, Sabra's authority faltered. Talia's voice, quiet but firm, broke through. I heard her say it once. I heard her tell Ziva the second will was for her. The room fractured instantly. Dalia began to sob, overwhelmed, while Basia muttered curses, his fists clenching. Sabra tried to speak, but her words stumbled, falling flat against the journal still lying open on the table. Truth doesn't need to shout, I said evenly. It just needs to stand. I placed the journal on the table, leaving it there like evidence on display. It no longer belonged to me alone. It belonged to every eye in that room. The notary rose, his voice steady now, louder than before. This journal will be submitted alongside the second will as evidence. The truth cannot be ignored. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. A neighbor whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. She burned a will, and now this. Shameful. Another relative leaned close to his wife, shaking his head. Imagine, a lawyer who disgraces her own mother's memory. Sabra's face reddened, her lips pressed thin. She sat rigid in her chair, but her reputation cracked in real time. For years she had paraded her image of control and success, but now, in front of family, neighbors, and the notary, the mask was torn away. I didn't need to gloat. Humiliation in private stings, but humiliation in public scars forever. I stayed silent, letting the whispers swell and then fade into a heavy quiet. Every eye carried judgment, not toward me, but toward her. Justice didn't roar. It whispered, and everyone heard it. The house emptied slowly, like air seeping from a balloon after the storm of truth had burst inside it. Chairs scraped against the hardwood, hushed voices floated around me as relatives shuffled toward the door. Some dared to glance in my direction, pity in their eyes, judgment in others, but none of them lingered. The neighbors left with murmurs, their whispers hanging heavier than their presence had. Sabra's face had been stripped bare, her composure reduced to a mask cracked at every edge. Batia stalked out with clenched fists, muttering to himself, his shoulders tense with rage he couldn't unleash here. Dalia kept weeping, her sobs echoing down the hallway as though grief could cleanse her of guilt. Talia, ever the quiet shadow, slipped away with her head bowed, avoiding my eyes. And I sat there, still. They had all the noise, but I had the truth. And truth stays longer. For a moment, the silence felt almost holy, though tinged with exhaustion. Winning hadn't erased the wound, it had only made me more aware of its depth. Americans admire resilience, I thought, but they rarely understand what it costs. Tonight, the cost was heavy. Later, in my room, I unzipped my bag. The journal lay at the top, its worn leather cover catching the lamp's light. I opened it carefully, turning past the pages I had already read, until I reached the very end. There it was. My breath caught as I saw the words written directly to me in her familiar slant. If you are reading this, it means you stood alone. Remember, alone does not mean powerless. You are more than they will ever admit. The ink was steady, no trembling lines, no hesitation. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were the tears that come when someone reminds you who you are. It felt like she was in the room again, her hand on mine. Words from beyond the grave can be heavier than stone. They embrace you and break you all at once. I thought of Hemingway's words. Courage is grace under pressure. That note was her final embrace, her way of saying she believed I had that grace. I pressed the journal to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." The decision was clear. Tomorrow, I would leave, not as the broken daughter they wanted me to be, but as the woman she knew I was. I sat on the edge of the bed, reflecting on what family had meant all these years. Blood can shelter, but it can also imprison. I remembered a saying, "Some families are built on love, others on control." My siblings had chosen control, each word and act designed to keep me beneath them. But my mother had chosen love, and that was the inheritance no one could take. The grief was still there. I hadn't just lost my mother, I had lost the illusion of family unity, the fantasy that blood would be enough to bind us. That illusion had burned away like the will Sabra had set to flames. Yet I felt no regret as I looked around the room. I packed methodically, clothes folded, the towel with my name carefully placed on top, jewelry boxes, heirlooms. I left them behind. They no longer carried meaning. What mattered was what I carried inside me, not what glittered in a box. Survival, I realized, is about what you choose to keep, not what you inherit. I zipped the bag and looked around one last time. Freedom doesn't come when they give it to you, I said quietly to myself. It comes when you stop asking. That night, I walked slowly through the hall, the journal clutched against my chest. The house seemed larger in its emptiness, each creak of the floorboard echoing like a memory. The smell of lavender polish lingered faintly, my mother's final fingerprint on this place. At the front door, I paused, turned back, and whispered, "Goodbye, Mom. Thank you." The night air wrapped around me, cool and freeing. Stars dotted the Ohio sky, sharp and clear as if cut into the darkness with purpose. They thought they cut me out, but all they did was set me free. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains, spilling across the living room like a spotlight on a stage not yet cleared of actors. Relatives filed in once more, though their faces carried different expressions now, no longer eager to hear Sabra's voice, but expectant, cautious. Neighbors lingered by the walls, whispering among themselves, watching. Even a local church elder had come, folding his arms as though prepared to judge not just our family, but the morality of it. Sabra was already at the center, her voice crisp and practiced. "Legal processes take time," she announced, chin lifted high. "One emotional outburst doesn't change the law." She gestured with her hands, commanding the room like she had so many times before. Betrayal leaned forward with folded arms, trying to look stern. Dahlia dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief, her weeping rehearsed by now. The notary sat stiff, eyes flicking toward me, but saying nothing. I stepped in quietly, the journal pressed to my side. My silence carried weight. It rippled through the room more than shouting could have. Power doesn't always arrive in thunder, I thought. Sometimes it arrives when you don't flinch. Sabra's eyes darted toward me, irritation flashing as if my calm were more dangerous than any accusation. She straightened and raised her voice, sharp this time. "Do you really think a few lines in a journal outweigh the law? Ziva manipulated this. She pressured our mother. That's what you all should know." The words cracked in the air, but the community didn't buy it. I heard the murmurs start almost instantly. "She pressured her dying mother?" "No," one neighbor whispered. Another shook his head, muttering, "I saw her at church every week, sitting with her mother. That doesn't sound like manipulation." Sabra's voice grew shriller, more frantic. She was always fragile, always emotional. "Who here hasn't seen her act like she's the victim?" Basia nodded, trying to back her. "She exaggerates everything. She wants pity." Dahlia clutched her handkerchief. "Mother would never divide us. This is Ziva tearing us apart." But their words hung hollow, falling like stones in a well too deep to echo back. The community wasn't with them anymore. I remained still. There was no need to shout down their lies. I remembered something I once read. Let the guilty speak long enough, and they condemn themselves. Sabra kept pushing, her voice cracking under the strain. "She's desperate. She's twisting things for her own gain." The notary cleared his throat, but I still said nothing. Silence was sharper than interruption, and with every word, Sabra's dignity bled out in front of everyone. Finally, I stepped forward, placing the journal on the table with deliberate calm. "This isn't mine to guard anymore," I said, my voice steady. It's hers, and now it's the truth for all of you. The notary leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. This journal, in her hand, is indisputable. It will stand alongside the second will. That is the law. The words landed like a verdict. Sabra's shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed into a line. For once, she had nothing to add. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that suffocates. Everyone stared, judgment hanging heavier than any gavel could strike. Neighbors exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others whispering prayers. I gathered my bag, lifting it onto my shoulder. My belongings were few. What mattered wasn't what I took, but what I chose to leave. Sabra's voice cracked behind me. You think this is over? You think walking away makes you right? I didn't turn back. Revenge isn't always taking something from them, I said, more to myself than to her. Sometimes it's walking away while they choke on what they tried to steal. I walked past the notary, who lowered his gaze respectfully, and past the neighbors, who parted without a word. The journal was no longer with me. It stayed on the table, proof anchored in the house where lies had once ruled. The door opened, sunlight flooding in. Stepping outside, I breathed deeply. Freedom felt lighter than victory. The note from my mother echoed in my heart. Alone does not mean powerless. For the first time, I believed it. I reflected as I walked down the front steps. Sometimes you have to lose a family to find yourself. My siblings had chosen control, but I chose independence. I wasn't bound by their poison anymore. The morning was crisp, the air sharp with the promise of something new. I tightened my grip on my bag, not heavy with inheritance, but light with resilience. At the gate, I paused, turned back only once, and whispered, "They fought for money. I fought for truth." And truth was the only inheritance worth keeping. Then I walked away. No anger, no regrets, just silence. Powerful, unshakable silence. I left in silence, but the silence spoke louder than their screams ever could.